is on the line from Western Australia, Gerry Georgatos. Gerry, welcome back.
Hi, Paul, and always glad to be on CAAMA. This issue is one that's sensitive to many, but we need a legacy of change.
We certainly do. You've been following this case like most of us from the very beginning, and I think what is tragic about Ms Dhu's death, it was preventable, and the coronial inquest today, I'm sure we'll be hearing evidence that would support that fact, but more importantly, it will also give evidence that would suggest there needs to be systemic change across this country.
There needs to be systemic change, but it's no more needed than in Western Australia, and I've often said the more we go across this continent, the worse it gets for First Nations people, all the hits in terms of the narrative of extreme poverty, homelessness, arrest and jail rates, and it's third worst in South Australia, second worst in the Northern Territory, and worst in Western Australia. In Western Australia, we jail our First Peoples from a racialised lens at the world's highest rate. Today, 1 in 13 of all Aboriginal adult males in Western Australia are in prison. That's 1 in 13. It doesn't get any worse anywhere in the nation, not anywhere else in the world. Ms Dhu's death, I knew about that on the day, August 4 in 2014. I was called by distressed family members. I knew then that this one, sadly, tragically, would have to bring about systemic changes. The visibility of the underlying factors and issues that led to her death are pronounced, and we shouldn't have lost the young lady, the young Ms Dhu, 22 years old, in that police cell. And there are no words for the loss of this young woman, as I found myself the first time I was speaking to a mother and a grandmother, Della and Carol Rowe. The first words I said to them, there are no words for your loss, no words for your loss. And similarly so with the coronial inquiry, there will still be no words for a loss and no justice that can come for a loss. But what we need is a legacy of changes in the name of this young woman who was so unnecessarily lost. What had occurred on that day, August the 2nd, on the Saturday in 2014, was that there was a call out by police to a disorderly. And the young woman was the victim of that disorderly and needed to be supported into crisis care or supported into hospital care for what will actually come out of this coronial inquiry that were life-threatening injuries. But that didn't occur. And 48 hours after her arrest, or within 48 hours of her arrest, she would pass away on the floor of that jail cell, and that will come out in my view in this coronial inquiry. What had occurred was at 12:30 on the Saturday, they detained her after doing a background check and found that she had fine defaulted, that she owed somewhere in the vicinity of $1,000 in fines, which to me is a civil matter, not a criminal matter, but the laws in Western Australia are behind the times. In New South Wales, for instance, in 1988, it was outlawed or prohibited for the jailing and convicting of fine defaulters. And 27 years later, in Western Australia, we are still to see these laws outlawed. And fine defaults have actually led to a huge number of people through the Western Australian prison system, black and white. So it's a piece of legislation that we need to sort out. Police will argue that they're effectively obliged to do what the law requires them to, and that's what they did. They detained her and locked her up on those fine defaults. 9:20 that night, on the Saturday, August 2nd, they took her to the Headland Health Campus, or she had arrived at the Headland Health Campus after complaining of chest pains and not feeling well at all. And she was discharged from the health campus at 9:45, 25 minutes later that night, and back into the police, who had no other recourse but to bring her to the watch house. She was prescribed diazepam and endone and an analgesic as they would say, and will be stated later, to settle her down and to relieve her of the pain that she was suffering. In my view, there was a systemic failure there. It could be argued, and I will argue it, that bringing in a young Aboriginal woman, stereotypes washed of two police officers on either side, that it was more to do with a disorderly than to do with a life-threatening injury or illness that need to be diagnosed, observed and treated, and she should have been hospitalised that night. She should have been hospitalised, treated and followed through care in terms of observation. Instead, she went back to the police cell and on the endone and diazepam, and was brought back a second time on the Sunday, complaining of unwellness, and then on the Monday, she was complaining once again. She was actually on her knees begging. CCTV footage will be released that will show her last hours in that cell, and I believe it will show that she was on her knees begging for help, complaining of pain, and may show that the police officers did not necessarily believe her or were having issue with it. And I can feel sorry for them too, although, there's no excuse for not responding with medical treatment or calling in an ambulance. And the police union behind the scenes has called me in the past or whatever to try and lobby where they can't publicly for the custody notification service so they can be relieved of the value judgments in terms of health that they shouldn't be obliged to be making. And I do know the police officers right across Western Australia don't want to be making these judgments and do want to be relieved of the burden of having to make them. And the other witnesses in that cell, which included her partner, Dion Ruffin, and a 61-year-old gentleman in another cell, argue that she was begging for her life, that she was telling them how unwell she was, and the police were allegedly stating, stop acting, get up, and making assumptions of her, rather than obliging themselves to responding to her complaint of issue with her health. She slumped, fell to the floor, and never got up again. And that's when the police went in there and responded. It will be argued that there was no pulse, and that they picked her up, carted her into the back of the pod of a police vehicle, and then took her to the health campus. It will be argued that when she arrived at the Headland Health Campus, she was presumed lifeless without pulse, and they immediately sent her to a resuscitation area, expended 1 hour's effort in trying to resuscitate her, and 1 hour later they would pronounce her dead.
The coronial inquiry will hear fact. As you've suggested, the police themselves have questioned the process that they have to deal with, that they're obliged to deal with. At the end of this coronial inquiry, without preempting what the coroner will decide, at the end of it, it's another Black Death in custody. I mean, how many more of these, how many more coronial inquests do we have to go through before governments understand that they have to be proactive in removing any situation which will allow a young Aboriginal man or woman who's taken into custody for not paying a fine to end up not leaving that custody? Now, people looking on at this coronial inquest will be wondering what is going to come out of this.
Well, look, I often put it this way. We have these reports, we have these inquiries, we have coronal inquiries, we sometimes have damning findings, we have recommendations. I'll argue that most parliamentarians that I've crossed paths with these days and over the last 2 decades have not read the majority of the recommendations from the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. I'll argue that most parliamentarians and their staffers have not read the reports that come out one after another, year in, year out, on the high incarceration rates, the underlying factors, on deaths in custody, on the maltreatments. Because for every death in custody, there are obviously scores of maltreatments and various neglect or whatever to culminate in that tip of the iceberg, the worst outcome, which is a death in custody. So for me, in the end, this is, and it must be stated, it's discrimination and it's racism. And racism has many veils and layers, but in the end, call it what it is. It's racism. The fact is that when you've got such disproportionate incarceration rates from a racialised land, when you've got Western Australia jailing its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, its First Nations people at the world's highest rates, when you've got, the Northern Territory not far behind and jailing, and 86% of its prison population comprised of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, when you've got South Australia not far behind the Northern Territory, and, these disproportionate rates in the 12th largest economy on the planet, are clear indictments of the racialised nature of this country's policies and of racism. Until we get right what we need to stop the low-level offending in terms of incarcerating people for low-level offending, so the tsunami of poverty-related issues, and address the racialised economic inequalities, we're going to continue to have these high incarceration rates, and they're going to increase each year. And, I've already estimated that by 2025, 50% of the prison population, the Australian prison population, will be of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we'll go up from the 27-28% that we have at the moment, and we'll be 1 in every 2 Australians in prison will be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. I've already done the research, and, it shocked me because the extensiveness of the incarceration rates are just abominable. They're an abomination, moral, political, and otherwise. But whereas a few years ago I had estimated that 1 in 20 of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders living have been to prison, and I thought that's a narrative of human misery and suffering and of psychosocial, psychological, and psychiatric impacts that reach just about every nuclear Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family in this nation. Well, in fact, it's no less than 1 in 10 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living have been to prison, and possibly up to 1 in 6 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living on this continent have been to prison, with the worst impacts felt in the Northern Territory and in Western Australia, and then thereafter South Australia. And we still do nothing about it other than rebadge reports each year and argue some very basic premises and tenets. The solutions are simple, and some coronial inquiries in the past have proffered the solutions. Certain reports have proffered the solutions, and certainly the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody made a number of good recommendations, some that have been taken up, but the majority that haven't been taken up, and it also varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in terms of state and territory. But the issues that were so pronounced and so visible in the death of Ms Dhu, touched me to such a great deal that I knew that there was an opportunity for change here. And it was, after speaking to family members on August 4th, after breaking the story out in independent media and then through the Stringer, and I then decided we needed to do something more than just, argue forever and a day about all the wrongs and ills. So I got on a plane, and a couple of weeks after Ms Dhu's passing, and I flew to Canberra, and I met with the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, the Federal Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Senator Nigel Scullion, and I put to him that, this death, as I've already said, there are no words for a loss. For a family, that toll will remain till the end of days, and even to trauma recovery and healing so long. There are no words for it. We still need that legacy of change. We still need that legacy of change. So what happened to Ms Dhu doesn't happen to anyone else. If Ms Dhu had a stout advocate on the day of her detainment and arrest, if Ms Dhu had somebody from a custody notification service in Western Australia, we don't have a custody notification service in Western Australia, nor in the Northern Territory, nor anywhere else but in New South Wales and in the ACT, it is my firm belief we would have her with us here today, that she would still be alive. And the Custody Notification Service is a $500,000 a year project where a stout advocate from the Aboriginal Legal Service, 24/7 on roster, is where they're trained to actually engage with a detainee immediately upon arrest. The police, by law in New South Wales and the ACT under the Powers and Responsibility Act 2005, cannot produce a charge sheet, cannot take evidence. It is not admissible in court till at first contact has been made between a stout advocate or the Custody Notification Service and the detainee. And what that goes to is they're trained to identify suicidal ideation, to psychosocially build up people, and to de-escalate predicaments. But they will advise police, and police must, follow suit. They will advise police on the health, welfare, and legal rights of the detainee. Now, the detainee will be empowered by the knowledge they've got somebody on their side. And if we had actually had somebody there for Ms Dhu, I believe that she would be in hospital care 24/7 from August the 2nd and properly diagnosed and treated and responded to whenever she may have gone into physical crisis. And more than likely she would be alive today. The coroner inquiry, findings, and what we'll hear in the next 2 weeks will have much to say about this. But the Custody Notification Service is a no-brainer. In New South Wales, since its implementation in 1998 and then the Powers and Responsibilities Act in 2005, From 1998 to the present, it has led to zero deaths in police watch houses of First Nations people. They have made contact with about 15,000 detainees per year. But, Paul, the service only costs $500,000 a year in funding. $500,000 a year in funding. The coronial inquiries cost that much. So it's a no-brainer. I'm tired of economical imperatives, but, if there it is also there for those who are about the fiscal benefit. I'm more about moral imperatives, and I hate discussions about economical imperatives. But the reality is it only costs $500,000. It can be rolled out in every jurisdiction in this nation, and it is. I've argued to Senator Scullion, to the Minister, and he agreed. He agreed that it should be rolled out in Western Australia, and it should be rolled out in the Northern Territory at the very least. His words to me were, Gerry, will go figure. If it's led to zero deaths, and that speaks for itself. He has become a strong supporter of the CNS, and he advocated for it in New South Wales, and he's the person responsible for its continuation. He's at odds often with his own party for their poor decision-making, so he's been the standout on this or whatever. But we also need it in Western Australia, and he flew to Western Australia in February of this year on my behalf to argue with the Western Australian government to urge them to actually implement the custody notification service in Western Australia and to find alternatives to jailing fine defaulters. After that meeting in February, soon after, the West Australian government announced a working party to address the high rate of low-level offenders, to work towards implementing a custody notification service and how they would go about that, and to also find alternatives to the jailing of fine defaulters. Well, that's all well and good, but it's now been 7 months since that announcement, and it's been a glacial pace of change. What we need then is the custody notification service is a no-brainer. That needed to be implemented straight away, and it should be implemented now. And if this coronial inquiry does nothing else but get that implemented straight afterwards, before Christmas, well, that's good. And then we've got to work towards the legislation that needs to wipe out do away with the jailing of fine defaulters. That should be a civil matter. That's not a criminal matter. We're filling our prisons with the mentally unwell and the poor and who are not criminally minded. And I can tell you that in Western Australia, 25% of the prison population are people who have originally gone into prison for fine defaulting. That's just an abomination. But this is what we need to come out from the coronial inquiry, damning findings and indictments, and that the fact that this woman would still be alive today, and the family not going through what they've gone through, Carol, Della, Rowe, and also Uncle Sean Harris, for them not to have gone through what they've gone through, the loss of their daughter, granddaughter, and niece, and to have to campaign for that sliver of human dignity and justice, and still not have it got. 1 year ago, Premier Colin Barnett promised that he would work in his remaining time in Parliament to respond to deaths in custody, to the high incarceration rates. Well, it's been 1 year now. It's actually 14 months since that promise. He needs to respond with action, and some of this stuff, I know for a fact, does not take much legislation and does not take much discussion. It's just about having the will and putting it in place. But, how many more deaths are we going to have? Your question's pertinent. How many more deaths are we going to have? And unnecessary, avoidable deaths. Deaths that should never have happened before we start implementing what we all know should be there.